Thanks for joining today's webinar. My name is Jennifer DiGianardo. Today's topic I will be covering today is how to properly float CDOH assistance. So how did we get here? The Division of Housing provided gap funding to assist with acquisition, new construction, rehabilitation, etc. of the project. In turn, a portion of those units are considered CDOH assisted or restricted, and that number of assisted units is based on the amount invested into the project, so the dollar amount invested into the project. The Division of Housing and the owner enter an agreement to restrict units by bedroom size and area median income percent for a specific length of time known as the period of affordability, or for short, the POA. Now, this agreement is our enforcement mechanism. It's called the Use Covenant or Beneficiary and Rent Use Covenant and Regulatory Agreement. This document is recorded at the local county's clerk and recorder office, and it stays with the land, which means that it's non-transferable to an alternate property, and it stays with any successors, assignees, leasees, aka any changes in ownership, any management that turns over, it's going to stay with that property throughout the remainder of the period of affordability. Again, the number of CDOH assisted units is based on the bedroom size and the area median income percent. The period of affordability is based on the funding source. So when federal dollars are applicable, we will be looking at those regulations that speak to the dollar amount or per unit investment, and that will tell us how long that affordability period should last. When there are local dollars, those state-funded dollars, we will create that period of affordability that I'm typically seeing 30 years at this time. Now, our covenants will specifically state whether our units are fixed or floating. And for fixed, those will be specific units that are CDOH assisted and designated prior to contract execution, and they will never change. Those, for an example, this will be units A, B, C, and D. Again, those will remain A, B, C, and D throughout the period of affordability and will not float. They cannot move away from those units. An example of the language you'll see in our use covenant is at the bottom here, 8.2.2, which says fixed units, location of HDG assisted units will be fixed throughout the period of affordability. Now for floating, these units are designated as CDOH and they may float over time. So be sure to look to your use covenant to ensure, do they float or are they fixed? Now, floating units gives that owner and management some flexibility with assigning units and maintaining program compliance over time. You'll see in this example, these home-assisted units will be floating units over the period of affordability. The floating units are typically our typical current practice, and that's what we see typically in our use covenants. If it's unclear if your units are fixed or floating, please do reach out to your asset manager. So when should I float CDOH assistance? Examples would be when a household is over the allowable income limit. Maybe there's an increase in their wages, maybe they have new benefits, and that puts them over the allowable limit. Maybe there's a change in household composition that results in over-income household. Someone left, someone joined the household, and now they're over that allowable limit. Maybe it's a higher education student, which means that we cannot overlap that home funding with that unit. Or even lawful presence. Say someone had an expired green card, can no longer or will no longer certify that they have lawful presence. This needs to be floated to an alternate unit. Again, with lawful presence, this is specific to federal funding, and you do not have to follow that requirement with our local state funding sources. Now, floating assistance next steps. You're going to review the property portfolio in its entirety and identify an alternate household that is comparable in both bedroom size and AMI percent. And I'll dig into more what that means in a moment. Again, you're going to review the proposed replacement household file So you can determine the eligibility. So you're looking for applications, correct verifications for the income and assets. You're calculating that income, and it's documented calculation. For federal programs, you have lawful presence. There is a lease in place, all of that good stuff. You're going to redesignate that unit at the new CDOH assisted unit's annual recertification. And we'll dig into an example in a moment. So you're going to designate the CDOH assisted households file. You're going to go to the project cover sheet and the tenant income certification under Part 4 program type as CDOH assisted. So you're looking at both of those to say, okay, this household was home assisted, and we're going to state that this household is no longer assisted effective this specific date. It is now floating to the alternate unit household. We're going to make sure both household files are documented properly. Highly recommend using a clarification record so it's very clear, when it took place, who was the manager that made this floated unit happen. Make sure the file tells all the details. If you don't see it in the file for division of housing, it never happened. So we want to make sure that that file continues to tell that story, both of those files. We highly recommend tracking CDOH units via a database, a rent roll report, spreadsheets, etc., to ensure management knows which units are CDOH assisted units at all times. It is on management and ownership to determine those home assisted units and track them throughout the period of affordability. So if Division of Housing comes on site for a monitoring, we're going to look to you guys to say these are our CDOH assisted units. If there are more than one CDOH funding source, ensure that it's clear which type of funding it is. So if we have home and housing development grant, we want to make sure you specify CDOH-home, some kind of example of that. If there is another, say home is another funding source, we want to make sure that Division of Housing's home and another agency's home are treated separately, and making sure that we know who is that agency it's tied to. As a friendly reminder, we cannot overlap home with another home or housing trust fund, making sure that we do not overdo that subsidy amount. So we underwrite to a specific subsidy per unit. We want to make sure that we stay within those limits. Any updates to the CDOH designation should be reported with the replacement tenant file included. So as we're doing monitoring, you're going to want to provide us with that replacement file. Now, unit comparability for floating units. Again, we're talking about the unit size, so we want to make sure that if it's a 2-bedroom, we're floating to another 2-bedroom. The square footage also needs to be comparable. So say we're in a 700 square foot unit, it needs to be transferred to a 700 square foot unit. The amenities, they need to be similar to that original unit. So say that there are specific appliances, a washer and dryer in unit A. We need to make sure that unit B also has those amenities to ensure that we're properly floating the assistance. Otherwise, it is no longer comparable and we cannot float that assistance. Now, there are times that temporary non-compliance will come up. With your fixed units, you cannot float assistance to an eligible household. Those are units A, B, C, and D, and they will stick to those 4 units. So when a household's income rises above 80% of the area median income, I realize we're missing income on that slide, the tenant is required to pay 30% of their income. That is to make sure that we're not over subsidizing again. The floating units, if there's no other eligible household or a comparable unit to float the assistance to, we're in limbo for a brief moment. We're considered temporarily out of compliance until a new household comes available and we can float that assistance. The monitoring will remain open when we find that there is temporary non-compliance until a new unit is designated. So the Division of Housing will have to ensure, was this unit floated properly, especially the timing. We want to make sure that that is done prior to closing out a monitoring. Again, we're going to be looking for, in the new household file, an application or an income and asset questionnaire. We're going to look for a valid government issued photo ID. We're going to be looking at the issue date and the expiration date on this ID. We're going to be looking for a residency declaration or lawful presence affidavit for federal funds only, not applicable to state funds. We're looking to verification of income and assets. All income and all assets must be verified, no matter the value, the dollar amount. We're going to be looking for a calculation of annual income as well. We want to make sure that that calculation is exactly as we see it in the file. So we're making sure that the proper wages are being calculated, all of that good stuff. We also want to see a lease agreement. Typically, we see a year long. That's what the ideal lease is. Unless mutually agreed upon, it can be a shorter lease. And of course, we want that Violence Against Women Act lease addendum. So why is this important? It ensures compliance with our executed agreement, that use covenant or regulatory agreement, and both the state and federal statutes. It's important because we want to reduce the risk for loan grant repayment and having to return those funds to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. So we want to minimize that as much as we can, and making sure that you communicate this with your asset manager will keep you on the right track. So we have an example. Millie rents a 2-bedroom at 30% AMI CDOH assisted unit in Denver. While you guys were completing her September 1st annual paperwork, you noticed that her income puts her over the allowable limit. So you're going to look through your portfolio, and then you find Abby. Abby is income eligible at 30%, and she also resides in a 2-bedroom unit. Now, Abby's annual is October 1st. Therefore, you require Abby to obtain the verification for her income and assets. You're doing that because you want to ensure Abby is, in fact, income eligible. You don't know if she's fully income eligible until you fully verify income and assets. So you've calculated Abby's income based on the verifications provided, and you confirm, yes, she is income eligible for CDOH assistance. You'll look to Millie's file, the original CDOH assisted unit, and document. Millie is no longer CDOH assisted as of September 1st because she is over income. We are going to float this unit, the assistance, to Abby. And the most important the key thing that I want to hit home here is that the property is considered temporarily out of compliance for the month of September, because we're saying Millie is no longer eligible. Abby does not get that CDOH assistance until October 1st. So temporarily out of compliance for September. October 1st, we're back on track with Abby's assistance. Abby now has that CDOH assistance. So for a quick recap, what is this? The CDOH assistance that's based on the amount invested into the property. In turn, CDOH restricts a fair share of units for the period of affordability. Again, that's identified in your use covenant, your regulatory agreement, and will specifically state the period of affordability. If there's federal funds, it will say the federal period of affordability, and then the Division of Housing affordability tacked on after that. Where and how are you going to document this? You're going to document any changes in household files, your database, any tracking sheets that you guys have as tools to ensure that you're following the CDOH covenant. Again, you're going to ensure both households document in forms, clarification records about that redesignation. What's tricky, again, the timing of when that assistance is floated. It's that interim period between Millie's September and Abby's October. It's that temporarily out of compliance. that makes these situations tricky. Could be a longer period. And so it's keeping an eye out, looking at your portfolio ongoing to keep an eye out again for those eligible households to float the assistance to. Now, what is the Division of Housing looking for when we monitor? We're looking to make sure that that assistance was properly floated. We're looking for the eligibility documents in that new CDOH assisted unit. Again, making sure if they are lawfully if they have federal dollars, they are lawfully present, photo IDs, income and asset questionnaires, verification, lease agreements, all of that good stuff. We cannot tell this household, or we cannot say for certain if they are CDOH assisted until we confirm eligibility. Now, should you have questions about any of the material covered today, you can contact us. You can contact me by the email on this slide, or of course, look to your asset management by the type of funding and geographic location. You can find that on our website there. And I just want to plug the other presentations we've done on our website. Really good resource on how to calculate income, how are those units, how are DOH units determined, and cross-cutting requirements, all of that good stuff. So highly recommend that you guys check that out. And I thank you so much for joining. And we will see each other soon. Thanks so much.